Today, let's talk about the #1 money-saving crop in the garden, and that is tomatoes. If you purchased tomatoes recently, you know how expensive they've gotten, but you can grow these guys in your backyard and get a huge saving. So to figure out how much money you can actually save in the garden by growing your own tomatoes, we have to figure out how much it costs to grow tomatoes. So you have to start out with either seeds or starts. So something like this, an MI Gardener seed packet is, I believe, $2.50, and you get somewhere between 20 and 30 seeds. So you can grow a lot of tomato plants with this one pack. Now, if you haven't gotten into your journey of growing from seed yet, you can definitely start from starts or baby plants. And while you won't get as much of a return on investment, you will still get one. And I'm going to base all of my calculations today on starting from starts because they are just easier and you can still get a really good return on your investment. Besides the seeds or a start, you're also going to need something to grow in. One thing that I absolutely love is something like this, like a 5-gallon bucket. This 5-gallon bucket, I believe, is $4 at Home Depot. You can also get them for free at places like at bakeries, at your local grocery store. I think Firehouse Subs sells them for just a couple bucks. If you're not into using the 5-gallon buckets, you can also do the fabric grow bags. You can usually buy them for $20 for a pack of 5 of them. So you're still getting that $4 return of how much it costs. After you have your pot to grow in, you're going to need some potting soil. And you don't need a lot if you're just starting with one plant. You can get one of the smaller bags of potting soils for about $4 to $6. Kellogg's is a really cheap brand. There's also, of course, the Miracle-Gro brands. It depends on whether you want to go organic or not. Miracle-Gro does have an organic. The organic potting mixes are going to cost more than the regular. You can also go on places like Marketplace or your local groups on your social media and find people who are selling compost or composted soil, a mix of soil and compost. So those are all options. That's usually, if you're going to be doing a lot of them, it will get the price down. And then the last thing you're going to need is some sort of fertilizer. Now, getting some sort of small liquid bottle fertilizer or even a granular that's very, very small is going to be your cheapest option. Fertilizer can get pretty expensive, but you really don't need a lot of this. I've had this bottle for over a year and it's still pretty full. And I have lots of tomato plants, so you don't even have to get something this big. I found one, it was a granular fertilizer at one of the big box stores, and it was $8 for a tiny small one. And the granular, you really only put down maybe once every month or two, and you're putting down like 2 tablespoons, so not a lot. So all of those costs to get started with your first tomato plant is about $21 to $22. Now let's talk about how much it's going to save. Now, a tomato plant can produce between 10 and 20 pounds of tomatoes is what's average. I've had plants produce way more than 20 pounds, and I've had some that barely hit the 10-pound mark, but I think you're pretty safe in saying that you're gonna get 15 pounds of tomatoes. In the grocery store right now where I live, when you account for beefsteak and vine ripe and cherry and grape tomatoes, it's about $2.50 a pound. If you get organic, it's even more expensive. So if you get 15 pounds of tomatoes off of your tomato plant at $2.50 a pound, that equals $37.50. So you only need 8.5 pounds of your tomato plant to produce for you to break even and pay back your $21 to $22 cost of setting it up. Now, the cool thing is this scales. So if you were to get, say, the grow bags, and you were to start from seeds, you could grow mini tomato plants. And every time those tomato plants got above that 8-pound mark, all of that is profit or savings, I guess is a better way to put it. Another way that growing tomatoes saves you money is you can actually take your tomatoes and use them to make things. So instead of just having tomatoes that you are going to eat fresh or even frozen, you can make your own spaghetti sauce, you can make salsa, ketchup, tomato puree, Bloody Mary mix, barbecue sauce, soup. I mean, honestly, you can do just about a million things with tomatoes. It's pretty wild how much you can create. And if you get into canning and preserving, you can take it even a step further. You can do sun-dried tomatoes. You can do, canning your diced tomatoes. You can make tomato paste, all of these things, and then you can store them either in your freezer if you'd like, or you can do some canning and place them on your pantry shelf. If you're interested in canning, I have a whole playlist on my channel on all of my canning recipes, and I did a whole video last year on all the different ways that I like to can tomatoes. So think about it. You're saving money on fresh tomatoes, and then you're also saving money on tomato products. And I feel like we go through those even faster than we go through fresh tomatoes. We have something tomato related almost every day, from spaghetti sauce on our pasta, barbecue sauce on our chicken, diced tomatoes in our rice and beans. We have sun-dried tomatoes in our salad. I mean, think about how often you have tomatoes or products with tomatoes, and you can replace the cost of those by growing your own tomatoes and making those products yourself. The third reason why I think that tomatoes should get the #1 spot for money-saving crops is how easy they are to grow. Now, starting them from seed can be a little bit tricky. There is a little bit of a learning curve when it comes to making sure that the moisture's right, making sure that they're getting enough sunlight, those kinds of things. But once you get past that and they get into their seedling stage, tomatoes are incredibly robust. They are super durable. They can handle pretty much any kind of transplanting. They can handle a lot of abuse, which is actually what has happened here to this plant. I'm sure you have noticed that my tomato plants don't look the most healthy, and that's because it is January. And we've had a frost come through, and I didn't cover them because I was away. I was on an RV trip, and so I wasn't here to cover them. I have my frost cloth now kind of wrapped around here, and whenever we get below it's going to predict that it's going to get below 35, I will pull the frost cloth up and cover them now. But they're still recovering from having frost. And everyone who's grown tomatoes knows they hate cold weather. Anything in the 40s and they're unhappy, So the fact that these are producing even when it's not optimal temperatures for them goes to show you that they are incredibly durable. Now, when you do grow them during the proper times, for here where I live, those proper times are going to be, we start them in August for fall tomatoes, and then we start them in January for spring tomatoes. You're basically trying to get them to grow before summer, or get them to produce before summer and before January, the dead of winter. But I'm trying to nurse these along. They're limping along in hopes that they can make it through winter, and they will actually continue to grow all the way through spring. It's a long season for tomatoes. I don't know if these guys are going to do it because they've been through a lot. So I have started some tomatoes this month from seed in my arrow garden as well as in trays. So you definitely want to make sure that you start your tomatoes at the proper time. It depends on where you live, is going to depend on what that time frame is. Like I said, if you're here in like the 9A, 9B, 10, 11, that's going to be August and January for us. Now, there's two different kinds of tomatoes, and you really got to take this into account if you're thinking about growing your tomatoes to make tomato products like those sauces, purees, tomato paste, salsa, those things that we talked about earlier. We have determinate and indeterminate types of tomatoes. So all of the ones right here are indeterminate tomatoes. And basically that means it grows for an indeterminate amount of time, meaning at this point right here will just keep getting taller, 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 growing more and more and more, and creating more of the branching for the flowers and then essentially the tomato fruit. A determinate tomato plant is one that reaches a determinate size or a determinate height. It reaches a maximum size or height. Usually they're much shorter, maybe about 3-4 feet, and they get super bushy. those, they fruit a little bit differently. Instead of creating these flower clusters on the plant as it moves upward and like an indeterminate, determinates are different. They have suckers. Well, all tomato plants have suckers, but the determinates have suckers, and those will produce the flowering clusters. And you don't want to prune determinate tomatoes because that's actually how they do their flowering, whereas indeterminate, you can prune them and they'll just shoot off the top. Now, the biggest difference between the indeterminate and determinate, besides their height, is how they produce tomatoes. Indeterminate's going to grow tomatoes all season long. So if I can get these guys to go till spring, it's going to keep getting taller, and those tomatoes are going to keep producing on the top. It'll slowly, as I pick these, they'll just start new ones up here. Now, determinate tomatoes are going to put on all of their tomatoes all at once, and they're going to produce a large amount all at once. So you could get your full 20 pounds of tomatoes in a matter of 1 to 2 weeks, whereas these guys are going to produce tomatoes 4 months on end, but they're going to produce a lot less. So if you wanted to do pasta sauces, salsas, tomato paste, all those kinds of things, you might want to lean into the determinate tomatoes because those will give you all of the tomatoes all at once. Then they're ripened all at once and you can process them all at once. Now, I use indeterminate tomatoes to make my sauces and stuff like that. All I do is once they get ripe enough, I just stick them in the freezer. And once I got enough, I pull them out of the freezer and then I process them. So you can do them either way, just how much freezer space and whether you want to have these big processing days or not. The other thing to consider on ease of growing is going to be whether you're growing a big tomato, like this beefsteak right here, or whether you're going to grow a little cherry tomato. So cherry tomatoes down here tend to do better and they tend to produce more. We have a lot of pest pressure, we have a lot of disease, and we have a lot of rain. And the rain actually causes cracking. That's what's happened to this one. We got a tiny bit of rain, and because we're in our drought season and we hardly get any rain, that sudden amount of tiny bit of rain caused some of my tomatoes to crack. Now, if you have big tomatoes on, like a beefsteak, and that happens, you're losing a very large tomato and a significant amount of your yield. Whereas if you have cherry tomatoes and a couple of them crack like that, you take those off and then the rest of the plant will continue to produce an abundant amount of tomatoes. I always find that cherry tomatoes outperform the larger tomatoes, but cherry tomatoes aren't always useful in making some of the products. I do make a spaghetti sauce with cherry tomatoes. I know that goes against anyone out there, I know. I think it's one of the best tasting sauces I make, but most people say you're supposed to use paste tomatoes for making tomato sauce. I make cherry tomato salsa. I can make all kinds of stuff. Now, cherry tomatoes have a lot more seeds and they are very, very watery. So they take a lot to cook them down to make these things. And sometimes even the best food mill is not going to get those tiny itty bitty seeds out. So that's one of the downsides. Whereas, you know, a paste tomato or a vine ripe tomato, they're going to be more of a middle size. So a paste tomato and a vine ripe, you can kind of get away with these. This is like the best of both worlds, right? You can grow more of these and you can use them in more ways. A beefsteak tomato is going to be the hardest tomato to grow here in Florida. You can see that even this one has some cracks. It's still good. The cracks healed over and it's ripening beautifully. This is a purple tomato. It's called Donna's purple tomato. It's because a lady from the channel, hi Donna, sent me these and they've become my absolute favorite. They do have some cracking though. And that's going to happen with beefsteak tomatoes. You're going to get cracking from just natural characteristic of that particular tomato. Some of them just crack more easily than others. You're going to get it from rain. If a bug bites it, you could potentially lose the whole thing. So beefsteaks are a bit of a gamble. I absolutely love to grow them, but they're a gamble and you could lose significant yield by starting with these. For the beginner gardeners or for somebody with a smaller garden, I would definitely stick to like a vine ripe or like a paste tomato. Now, some of my favorites, because I know that this is always a question that comes up, for the vine ripes, Neptune, Homestead, and Kiwola are probably my favorites. They grow really well here. Oh, Floridade, I almost forgot about that one. Most of them are bred for Florida. The Kewolo is actually bred for Hawaii, so kind of similar climate. Those do really well down here. Now for a paste tomato, I've tried a bunch of different kinds and I haven't found my favorite yet, but this year, the good old Roma did really good for me. So I might have to give them another look. I kind of cast them away years ago when I had a bad season. But this year they've given me the most paste tomatoes I've ever gotten. But I have also grown some, I think it was called Le Sweet, Japanese one. I've also done the plums and the Amish paste, like all of those. And the Le Sweet one was good and huge. It was a huge paste tomato, but it didn't produce very much. And then the other ones, they do okay, but they're a smaller paste tomato. Then you have your beefsteaks. I would say I go for the hybrid. The Better Boy hybrid is probably one of my favorites of beefsteaks. And then of course this one, unfortunately you can't buy these seeds. This is seeds that, you know, one of the viewers of the channel has been collecting over years and she's kind of adapted it. So unfortunately this is like a landrace tomato. So you can't necessarily buy this one, but I've heard that you could do Cherokee purples. That's a pretty big size tomato. Mortgage lifter, I didn't have a good result from mortgage lifter, but people swear by it. So maybe give it a shot. Now, when it comes to cherries and grapes, any of those kinds of tomatoes, oh my gosh, all of them grow here. But some of the honorable mentions, of course, Everglade tomatoes grow really easy. They're not my favorite. My favorite tiny tomato is going to be the red currant tomato. I think that one just tastes amazing. It's a much more acidic flavor, which I kind of like. Then you have Super Sweet 100s. That's a standard, really, really good tomato. The red pear, that's a lovely grape style tomato. There's a lot of different kinds. You can pretty much go kind of crazy when it comes to the cherries and the grape tomatoes because most of them are going to do well and a lot of them are just going to be super, super productive. I don't prune my cherry tomatoes. I do prune a lot of my bigger tomatoes, but my cherry tomatoes, I just kind of let them do whatever they want. They ripen pretty quickly. There isn't much of a need to keep them super pruned. The fourth way that a tomato has become my #1 money-saving crop is that you can save the seeds. Unfortunately, the tomato that I want to save the seeds from is this one, and it's not ripe enough yet. So I can't show you today, but make sure to keep an eye out. I'll do a short video later on where I show how I save my seeds. But I have to wait for this tomato to get basically almost rotten. You don't have to do that. You can wait for it to be pretty ripe, like pretty soft and ripe, and save the seeds then. But I want to ensure that the seeds are like super, super high germination rates. And the best way to do that is to let this tomato ripen a lot, like to the point where you kind of touch it and it's soft. That's the level you want. And this tomato's not there yet. I'm picking this one for a number of reasons. This is the least amount of cracking that I have found on one of these tomatoes. So I picked the plant that looked the healthiest and the tomato from the plant that had the least amount of cracks. And then I'll save the seeds from this one. And next year I'll do the same thing. I'll just keep doing that. Every year I'll grow the seeds from this tomato. And then whatever tomato has the least amount of cracks, I will save the seeds from that one. I'll get rid of the rest of them. There's hundreds of seeds in here, right? I'm not gonna grow hundreds of plants in one season, but I'm not gonna keep using these seeds every single season. I will save the seeds every single season and use the new seeds every single time. I hope that makes sense. Basically, what I'm trying to do is get to a point where I find that I have picked the tomato with the least amount of cracks so many times that I'm getting that characteristic, and hopefully in the future I'll have a plant that has no cracks. It will take a long time. This is going to take years, if not, a decade. But I'm committed because I love this tomato. So, and it's also not really hard to do. All I do is take one tomato that looks pretty good, set it on my counter and wait for it to become super ripe. And then the way to get the seeds out is you cut the tomato just like you would if you were gonna eat it, and you take your finger and push the seeds out into a little cup, fill the cup about halfway with water, stir the seeds up, set it on your countertop, wait a day or two. What you're waiting for is basically for the seeds to ferment a little bit. You want them to ferment so that the little encasing, it has like this jelly encasing around the seed, and you don't want any part of that stuck to the seeds that you're going to save. So you have to let it ferment that off. You don't want to ferment the seeds, you just want to ferment the little casing. And so you just, as you stir it up on a day-to-day basis or every 12 hours, whatever. I mean, guys, it's not, you don't have to be really specific. Just every day that you walk by it, just kind of stir it up. And eventually what you will see is you will see those little cases slip off the seed as you're stirring. You'll see these little gelatinous looking substance kind of floating around in there. That means they fermented enough for those to slip off. And once that's done, you pour off the top, or you scoop off the top, which is going to have all that gelatinous material on it, and then you pour the seeds through a sieve or a strainer, and then lay them out on a paper towel to let them dry, and then put them in some sort of like, envelope, nothing plastic. I use little paper envelopes. I think those work the best, but you can put them in, a regular mail envelope. And then you will have hundreds of seeds. Now, the thing to take into account with this is if you grow a lot of different tomato plants like me, you may end up cross producing your tomatoes, and your tomato may not look exactly like it did before. Or if you're saving the seeds of a hybrid, you may not get the same tomato that you did before. You're really not supposed to save the seeds of hybrids. I do sometimes, or accidentally I do, but sometimes a tomato might change. And if that occurs, keep your old seeds, try again, and this time you can try isolating the flowers. So the easiest way to do this is, as this tomato plant is producing its flower clusters, you put like a tool bag, or just some sort of baggie over it to where it can breathe. You can cut a piece of your frost cloth and wrap it around it. Keeps pollinators from moving from flower to flower to flower, causing it to become cross-pollinated. And then you just hand pollinate it by shaking the flower so that it drops. And once the fruit has formed, you can take that tool or that bag off of it, and from here on out, you know that it is only pollinated by itself. It's not pollinated from other tomato plants that are around, and you won't get that cross-pollination problem. I don't mind it. I feel like cross-pollination, unless I'm going for something like this where I'm really focused on it, if I'm just growing, Neptune, Homestead, Kiwolo tomatoes next to each other and they cross-pollinate, that's fine. I don't mind. As long as you produce well and your offspring produces well, I could end up with the little Frankenstein tomato, and that's okay. Just like I think what Donna did, you end up with a tomato that just works in your climate, works in your specific garden, and over the years it just gets better and better and better. You're hanging out with me today as we picked some tomatoes and talked about how money saving that they are. If you're interested in more money saving techniques, check out my top 10 money saving crops. Happy gardening, guys.